Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I will talk about the 10 cards that had the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they had to be part of set 6, Dark Frontier. For that I compiled a list of decks that topped official DireWolfDigital events or that reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. The tiers are either based on how far the deck went. For Direwolf events the top 8 and better is tier 1, everything below that is tier 2, or on how important the event was. For ETS events, each event that directly qualified for ETS Worlds is tier 1 and everything else is tier 2. For a more detailed explanation you can check out the introduction video into the series on my channel. Let's get started. Dark Frontier was released on May 9th, 2019, towards the end of the 2019 competitive season, right in time to make a big impact on the first official DireWolfDigital Worlds. It was never part of Expedition as a full set, except for the first version of Expedition that didn't have any official tournaments, but some of the cards were part of Expedition at some points. Let's start on rank 10 with Tokka's Waystone Harvester. He's a 3 power, double time influence 2/4 legendary unit, and while he's on the field, your opponent can't play spells on their units and you gain 1 max power and can twist and pay 2 to enhance that max power ability by 1. Twist was a mechanic exclusive to Dark Frontier in the following campaign Trials of Grodov. It means that a unit that twists gains 1 attack and loses 1 life. Tokka's was never part of Expedition unless you counted first version without tournaments, but it did see consistent play in time midrange decks and Throne from 2019 to 2022, and even 2022 onwards, but we don't have tournaments for that. In 2019 he was played in Praxis Pledge and Combri midrange deck, but he didn't really have a big impact on Worlds because none of those time midrange decks were good enough in that format. Before the 2020 season started, he was nerfed because that package of good stats, a ramp effect and a hate effect was deemed too strong, but he was still very playable afterwards. From 2020 onward, he was mostly played in scene and midrange decks because other time midrange based decks either died out, like Praxis or for the most part Compre, or because they had a heavy focus on the other factions, like Elysians, which was mostly primal based. But that package of stats, which were still fine, ramp and a hate effect was still nice, especially because the hate effect only got better over time. It's very impactful against sacrifice decks because it counters cards like Combust or Devour, and it's very strong against one of the most played decks in Throne since 2020, against Toru Kira, because it completely counters a big part of Kira's effect, and cards like Justice Etchings. It is also strong against some combo decks that are around at points, like decks that need Revive or Mirror Image to get their combo through. Next up, we have one of the flagship cards of early 2020 Expedition, Eclipse Dragon. He's a 5 power, double fire influence 4/4 rare unit with flying, charge and quick draw that grants you 3 power at the start of your opponent's turn. While he is mostly known for his success in Expedition, he also saw a fair amount of Throne play in 2019 and 2020. In 2019 he was mostly played in aggressive Stonescar decks, where he worked well with fast spells like Pre-Nerf Torch, which was still fast at the time, and Annihilate. He was also just a solid finisher that could attack into all commonly played flyers, like Shelterwing Rider, Valkyrie Enforcer, Winch's Merchant and Horror Pacifier, and everything on the ground except for Sandstorm Titan of course, but Sandstorm Titan was not widely played at the time. In 2020 Throne he was played in FGS midrange decks with fast spells like the aforementioned Torch and Annihilate and Display of Ambition and Defiance, and he saw some more play in Stonescar aggro decks, but he slowly got power creep towards mid 2020 and didn't see any Throne play from 2021 onward. Most of his points come from the 2020 Expedition format, where he saw play in tribal dragon decks, Stonescar dragons, Skycrack dragons, FPS dragons, and even some amount of FTS dragons, and in some other aggressive Rakano and Stonescar decks. In that format, he worked very well with commonly played cards like Blazing Salvo, which used to cost 1 and could grab Backlash to protect your own Eclipse Dragon from removal spells. And he worked well with Dragonforge, which could even grab another Eclipse Dragon, and Wisdom of the Elders. Next up is Tasbu the Forbidden. He's a 6/4 legendary unit for 5 power and 5 shadow influence with Deadly and Warp, and when one of your units dies, you take 1 damage and draw a card. Tasbu is part of a cycle of 5-cost legendary units that cost 5 of 1 influence and have Warp. And while the Justice one, Zedidi the Killing Steel, which we will also see later on the list, saw immediate success, Tasbu took a bit of time to take off. The buff in June of 2019 to count himself when dying definitely helped with that because it made him a lot better into removal. And shortly after that buff, he had his first stint of success in 2020 Expedition. He got added in late 2019 in addition to the whole cycle of those 5-cost legendary units, and he had by far the most impact out of them. He was in 20 decks of the top 64 of ECQ Strangelands, most of which were Archenport midrange decks. That deck also claimed 5 spots out of the top 8 in the tournament, and Lights Out Ace won it with that same deck. He showed similar numbers in the Winter Quarterly right after, but then the cycle got removed from Expedition with the release of Set 8, so he couldn't get any more points in 2020 Expedition. In Throne, he was occasionally played in Shadow midrange decks in 2020, but he only found a consistent home in Stonescar Seal decks in 2021 and in Xenon Katra / midrange decks in 2022. That exemplifies the importance of Set 9, especially for cards like Tasbu. That set added several strong payoffs for heavily playing into 1 influence, like the aforementioned Seal and Katra, which helped cards like Tasbu. The second nerf at the end of 2021 seemed to barely affect his playability if you just look at the numbers, because even though it made him weaker against aggressive decks because he couldn't block as well anymore, he could still gain card advantage and put on pressure at the same time, which still makes him a strong 5-drop to play in Throne. Next up we have the second wave of smugglers, specifically Rime Conclave Smuggler. He's a free power Justice Primal Influence 3/1 rare unit. He grants himself and your Aegis on Onslaught, in addition to the usual merchant effect of swapping a card in your hand for a card in the market. Onslaught is another set 6 plus Trials exclusive mechanic. It's basically a summon effect that is only active if you have attacked with a unit or relic weapon on the same turn. In Throne, he was originally played in Horror Control and Horror midrange decks, but in 2020 he got replaced by Teneth Merchant in Horror Control, and the Horror midrange decks died out for the most part in favor of Horror Kira. But luckily Rime fit perfectly into that deck, mainly because of his synergy with Bring to Justice, because you could summon him with his Onslaught effect active, grab the Bring to Justice from your market, and then have a basically free removal spell at the time, because Bring to Justice used to cost 0 power. And even after the nerf, it's still a pretty cheap removal spell. It's basically a 1-mana Slay that also silences the unit. He got the biggest share of his tops, 65 in total, from Horokira, even though he sometimes got cut after the nerf from 3/2 to 3/1 stat line, but he's still part of most of the Kira lists. Additionally, he got some points in Expedition because he was part of it at the start and end of the 2020 season, where he saw play in Horror Renown and Mastery decks, Horror Curses, and some free faction control decks. Now I want to shortly talk about the other 4 smugglers released in Set 6 Dark Frontier. Gen Wastes would have made the list, but as I said in the introduction video, only the one with the highest total will make the list. He was a staple in Stonescar Acro deck since 2019, although sometimes he got replaced by either Ixton Merchant or Blazing Salvo, and he was also often played in Stonescar Seal and Sacrifice decks. Next up we have Blight Pass Smuggler, was part of most non-even Feln decks due to a good defensive stat line. That includes different incarnations of Feln midrange. It also includes Feln at any cost decks, FPS Drove decks, Feln Reanimator, JPS Kilo decks, and TPS Eclipse combo decks. East Annex Smuggler has to compete with the strongest merchant, with Aurelian Merchant, but she still found a home in aggressive Praxis decks, because in aggressive decks a 2/3 with charge is pretty nice, and in free faction decks like FTZ and FTP midrange and FTJ project decks, because she can grab some cards that Aurelian Merchant couldn't grab in those decks. Pearl Abbey Smuggler has the same problem as East Annex Smuggler, plus he also suffers from the fact that the best Compre deck of the last 3 years, Compre Equalize, doesn't want a lot of units. He still got some points from free faction control and combo decks, and Compre Kira, where he fits pretty well. On rank 6 we have one of the most changed cards of all time, Even-Handed Golem. He's now a 2-power factionless 2/2 rare unit with Void Bound, and on summon you can either draw a card, or he gains +2/+2 if you don't have any odd cost cards in your deck. The first nerf came fast and added Void Bound because of a scene in combo deck with Razor Quill, whose twist used to cost 1 power, and Stained Horror, who used to cost 2 power and had a 1/3 stat line, even though the deck wasn't very successful in tournaments. Other than that, he didn't see much play in 2019, but he got his breakthrough in 2020, where he started seeing widespread play in a wide array of midrange decks. A lot of the power cards from those decks got nerfed, and it's still debated how much Even-Handed Golem is to blame for some of those nerfs. Examples include Zodiac Spellshaper, which used to cost 2 power, and Nahid's Distillation, which used to cost 6 power. Even-Handed Golem also got nerfed in between, but the pure stat nerf from 2/2 stats to 1/1 stats was not impactful enough. He still saw a lot of play in Xenon midrange and Xenon or FTS Severin Reap combo decks, which led to additional nerfs, for example, of Gentle Grazer from 4 to 5 power and Severin from 6 to 7 power. Even-Handed Golem also started the season of 2021 strong, with 5 spots in the top 8 of ICQ Stormbreak, mostly in Feln midrange decks. He slowed down quite a bit after that and stopped seeing competitive play completely after the third nerf that changed him to the current form, which you can see on the left. Next up we have Royal Decree. Royal Decree is a 2-power primal influence spell that transforms a card in the opponent's hand into Seek power, and if you activate it with Onslaught, it also transforms all copies in hand and deck into Seek power. Seek power, of course, is a 1-power factionless spell that draws a sigil. That means Royal Decree is always negative in card advantage because you give up a card in your hand while your opponent will have the same number of cards afterwards, but there aren't a lot of ways to interact with cards before they are played in Eternal, especially in Primal, so it was important to counter some specific threats throughout the years. That led to it being played in the markets of a lot of midrange and control decks. In control decks, it was usually played with Challenge Merchant, because the Aegis meant that you was more likely to survive a turn, which meant you had a way to activate the Onslaught. It also saw some main deck play in Even-Handed Golem decks, because they couldn't play markets for the longest time, because each market access had an odd cost. And Royal Decree was nice in Even-Handed Mirror matches, because it would prevent future Golems from drawing cards if you activated it with Onslaught, because then the opponent would have Seek powers in the deck and those have an odd cost. So Even-Handed Golem wouldn't be active anymore. On rank 4 we have the second part of the 5 influence legendary cycle, and the only other one to make the list, spoiler warning here, Setidi the Killing Steel. He's a 5 power, 5 justice influence, legendary 5/5 unit with flying and warp. He also plays a Curse of Provocation on the opponent if played with Onslaught. And Curse of Provocation reads, at the end of the cursed player's turn, if no damage was dealt, draw a card. Zedidi had an immediate impact on the 2019 World season. At the start he was played in Horo midrange decks, but then DireWolfDigital decided to revert an earlier nerf of Icaria. She was nerfed to 8 power at the end of 2018, if I remember correctly, and then brought back to 7 power in mid-2019. And because of that, Rakano Valkyries dominated the World Finals, where they claimed 9 out of the top 16 spots and won the event in the hands of Atreus. Right afterward, the curse got nerfed. Now the opponent didn't need to hit you anymore. They could also deal damage to anything else, or even you could deal damage to something on their turn, and then you wouldn't get to draw a card. Zedidi was still very strong afterwards and saw play in Archenport and Rakano midrange in Throne, and Horo Curses in Expedition in early 2020, but it took until the release of Set 9, Archen Depths, and its subsequent campaign Awakening for him to amass the biggest share of his 127 tops. First, he was part of a Rakano influence deck, which was built around strong Justice influence payoffs like Ichin, which could also play the weapon on herself back then, and Ruffian, who would also grant lifesteal for a turn. That deck was nerfed into Oblivion though, but afterwards he found a home in Horo and Archenport Kira decks after Awakening came out in September 2020. The additional nerf at the start of 2020 slowed his progress down, but he still saw some play in Horo Kira and Archenport and Compre midrange decks in 2022. Next up is the only power cycle from this set, the Insignias. All of them do the same thing. They grant you an influence in their 2 factions, and they are undepleted if your deck only contains cards from those 2 factions. They are the same factions as Smugglers in the set, to finish the cycles started in the previous set, but this time the Stonescar version got slightly more points than the Horo version. Insignias are the strongest dual power for any deck that can play them, and a strong incentive to stay in 2 factions next to heavy influence payoffs like Tasbu. Because of that, they were played in every 2 faction deck. For Stonescar, that was mostly aggro until 2021, and then also the aforementioned midrange deck with Tasbu and Seal. Horo got carried by the immense success of Horo Kira. Before that, it also saw widespread play in Horo midrange in 2019 and early 2020, and from 2019 until today basically in Horo Control. Then we have a big jump down in points to the Compre Insignia, which at the start was mostly played in midrange and aggro decks, but at this point it's mostly played in the aforementioned T-Tray Equalize deck, sometimes also midrange, but for the most part it's played in a control deck now. Feln has almost the same amount of points, which it got with a mix of Reanimator, at any cost control, and different flavors of midrange. And clearly the last place, Praxis, didn't see a lot of success in recent years. We only had Sporadius, Praxis midrange, aggro token decks in Throne. Next up, we have a very efficient and flexible removal spell with Ice Bolt. It's a 2 power, 1 primal influence fast spell that deals 7 damage to any unit. Then its owner plays a sigil from their deck. Since late 2021, it also can't be stopped by Aegis or get negated anymore. Ice Bolt had the advantage of being part of Expedition in each year, but it also saw consistent throne play throughout the years. Most of its throne play comes from Horo Control, in which it was a staple from 2019 to 2020, and again post-buff in 2022. In that deck it was mostly played in the main deck, while the other decks it was commonly played in, Skycrack Aggro, Skycrack Yetis, Skycrack Midrange and Skycrack Sling, used it in the market most of the time. It offers a lot of flexibility, especially post-buff, and allows to deal efficiently with any unit, some of which would require either more cards or more expensive removal otherwise. Some examples from 2022 are Tafrod, who's hard to deal with for some primal decks, and Blank Wumpkin, who can quickly run away with games if you don't answer him quickly as a control player. Before we talk about the number 1 spot, here are some honorable mentions. Malediction didn't see a lot of round play, but it was a staple in 2020 Expedition and amassed almost enough points for this list because of its heavy usage in shadow markets back then. DireWolfDigital saw consistent throne play in time midrange decks and was especially attractive for even-handed golem decks because a maximum power buff on turn 2 allowed you to play 4 drops on turn 3. And the shift meant you could secure it against decks with a lot of efficient removal. Next up, Garden of Omens. It was one of the most powerful sides before it got nerfed. Before the nerf, it used to reduce the cost of all spells by 1. All your spells by 1. The mix of removal, relicate, and long-term value made it a perfect fit for control decks and an interesting option for midrange. It still saw some play after the nerf in late 2021, but it's way less powerful now. And for the last honorable mention, I included another member of the 5-cost legendary cycle, Rost. He was and still is an important piece of Sling of the Chi decks, but he couldn't find a consistent home outside of that, and Sling of the Chi was just not quite successful enough in tournaments to carry him into the list. And now for the number 1 slot, some of you might have already guessed it, we have Pristine Light. Pristine Light is a 3-cost double justice influence legendary spell that kills each unit with 4 or more attack, and that draws all your units that died this turn from your void if you activated Onslaught. It's a very powerful board wipe, especially against midrange decks, that can sometimes feel like a one-sided harsh rule because you can either play units with less attack to not get your own units killed, or you can just get your units back by attacking and activating the Onslaught. And sometimes it can also just act as a slightly more expensive Vanquish or a bigger Dark Return, and it's still like a good card. That flexibility made it a very attractive market and sometimes main deck card for a wide array of Justice decks over the years, so many that I can't name all of them here. In 2019 it was mostly played in the main deck of Horror Control and the market of Rakano Valkyrie decks, then in 2020 in different Justice midrange decks, Rakano Influence, and Horror and Archimport Kira. In 2021 it was basically played in the same decks, but those decks got less popular, so it got fewer points. But in 2022 it had a big resurgence as part of the Fearless Crescendo market in FDJ Broacher decks. Both of the cards mentioned used to cost 1 less power, so Crescendo was a 1 power spell and Creation Project was a 3 power relic. All of that combined allowed it to comfortably claim the number 1 spot on this list. With this, I'll end the first episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. The second part should come out today as well. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.